This particular conversation, ladies and gentlemen, is themed Economic Highways, a new language. What is the feminist language about economic empowerment that we should be having? And it's such a powerful question that I'm really looking forward to hearing the panelists unpack for us. I'll be the first one to admit, when I first heard the term economic highways, I thought to myself, I've never heard that before. What is the significance of this linguistic marker? Why is this different? Why are we starting to talk about highways? Why not pathways? And I remember having quite a deep conversation with Rehema as she began to unpack the importance of the language that we use and why it matters in how we then frame opportunity. What we're trying to get out of this conversation is to really understand the importance of feminist language as a starting point and how that helps us frame opportunity. And then if we are to latch on to this idea of economic highways, what do they need to look like? What do they need to be if we're really going to enable women to be in the driving seat? And then practically, how do these highways traverse political boundaries and allow us to tap into opportunities on the continent? So we're building on the earlier conversation, but we're putting on a different lens, a lens of language, a lens of economic highways in particular, and a lens of saying, what do these need to be, what do they need to look like, and how do they serve women? Ayanda, I see you back in the room. When you're ready, we've got are we trying to load a presentation for you? Where's Karen? Okay, can you please make sure to go, Sister Ayanda, for me? And so let me start off while we're here. And Lebohang, let me start off with you. And I'd love for you to lean into the conversation, to talk to us about the feminist language, the importance of why we need to bring that into the language of economics, and what that means for the way we frame opportunity. Again, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to give our speakers 5 to 10 minutes to land their big thoughts, and then we'll open it up into a dialogue.
Thank you. Dumelang, good morning. No, a bit more. Dumelang, good morning. Now I'm among sisters. Yeah, so thanks. This is a great conversation, and it's such a nice opportunity for us, Huiteba, to hear ourselves, to feel ourselves, to imagine ourselves. And these are luxurious moments. So I am very excited to be in this moment of luxury and co-creating with all of us. It's like the best spa, intellectual spa at Mangwanani with interest. It's just way more, right? So my inputs, I had originally prepared something around the AFCTA, but I think the previous panel probably slam dunked it really well. So I'll say a lot more about feminist language, because that's hitting Totakateo. I love. So I think I'd like to say one thing around feminist approaches and the new strands of gender development. So the one thing is to appreciate that feminist economics and feminist languaging is extremely and completely different to gender language and gender economics. Gender economics gives us the opportunity to arrive at the table after it's been set. Feminist languaging actually gives us the opportunity to define and determine what is going to be set at the table and whether, in fact, we're interested in what's on the menu. And I think that that's a really important definitional point of departure, because oftentimes it's like, gender, and then we wonder why it is that fundamentally so many policy framings remain exactly the same and give us the same results and outputs, which is peripheralizing, othering, and exclusionary. So this is the notion that women need to be catching up and chasing after the agenda, chasing after the policies, chasing after the opportunities. It's inherently problematic. That's my first hypothesis. Yeah. Secondly, I think it's also quite important to then explore the interface. I think I'll jump to this piece on global value chains, because we like levitating a lot around what global value chains mean. And I'd like to suggest that, in fact, global value chains are a series of interrelated clusters. They're relational. And we often speak of global value chains as if there are these things that are happening somewhere there, and while we're somewhere in here. We are part of the global value chain. It is not a distended abstraction. It is something that should be a participatory and ongoing way of doing business and relating in business. It's relational, it's organic, it's a continuum in which we're already involved. But there are differences for women. There are structural deficits in the way that we participate in these value chains. And I'd like to name one or two of them. So the one is that oftentimes there's a technology gap. And the technology gap is gendered. And you know, this fourth IR, which is not the scope of this conversation, but I'll just cross-reference it, is part of embedding this technological gender gap. And it suggests, again, a very masculine, scientific, rational way of doing business. There's nothing rational about business. I think a sister made a comment about doing business in different African countries, including this country. We've got our own moments of political stuff, right? And that in understanding that, all of that stuff is completely different to the notion of a rational man. And that, you know, the rational man is the neoclassical form of doing economics, which assumes that everybody is fully employed. It assumes that there's always going to be a competitive advantage. It assumes that I will always want what you're selling and that you'll always have the money for what I want to buy, right? It makes all of these sorts of rational, scientific assumptions, which in the real world and which certainly in African economies are not true. We don't have full employment, for one thing. We don't have markets which are deeply segregated across commodities, across sectors, and so on. Oftentimes, different countries produce the same stuff. Rice, cotton, beef. And this is exactly one of the challenges of the Africa Free Trade Agreement. How are we going to manage that? Okay, you've got sugar, I've got sugar. Whose sugar are we going to buy? Whose sugar are we going to consume? Simple things, right? You've got gold, I've got gold. Whose gold is shinier, right? So these are the things that we need. So when we talk about global value chain, they're relational, but they're also irrational because we live in an irrational world. I think the other thing that's quite important is that we often cluster global value chains across one key commodity. So each commodity will have its own global value chain, and yet there are interrelationships. And what this doesn't also understand is that rules of origin can be incredibly complicated when dealing with global value chains, because if a product was grown in Zambia, completed in Kenya, exported to Ghana, packaged in something that was made in China, rules of origin become really tricky, and even global value chain aggregation is difficult to then calculate. Righto. Right. And then I think the other thing is that there's also a link between households, firms, and states in the way that we do economics and in the way that value chains are configured, especially as women. The way that we do business is often, as I say, very relational, but also very intuitive. Then I think the next thing that I'd like to talk about is also the notion of the kind of social development indices, which are really important for framing the AFCTA and for framing the way that women do economics. So I mentioned that there's also there's a technology deficit and a technology gap. There's also an education bias and a technical bias. And it's not because we don't know what we don't know. It's often because the stuff that's valued is valued in the eyes of men, and it's valued in very technocratic terms. And the work that we do is often either called unpaid or care work. Right? What some of us would call in common sense chores, or call the hustle. It's called care work. So then we don't even want to measure it appropriately. Now, how then are we going to be able to get our states and our policy to recognize what I call hustleomics, right? IP is mine. But how are we going to be able to get our state to recognize that? And recognize that in terms of global value chains, where do we situate the hustle? And where do we also situate social development indices? And where are we also situating GDP growth and other measures of growth? So that comes to the third thing of feminist languaging. that growth is a multifaceted, multilinear phenomenon. It's not only situated in the domain of gross domestic product, it's also situated in the domain of educational attainment, access to opportunity, access to growth, personal and professional growth, right? Access to power, access to voice, access to legislative and policy frameworks which would move us from one point to the other. So that is a feminist framing of how we need to be thinking through a lot of our ideas, right? And I think on a final note, others I guess we can come back to if there are any other questions or whatever, that we need to really think about development in relation to self-determination. So feminist languaging is about self-determining our own destiny, our own ways of being, our own choice of doing business and how we want to do business. Remember I said that we're often running behind this cart that's already been painted for us, rather than deciding what car, if we even want to run after that particular car. Maybe I don't want a Pajero. Maybe Mina, I wanted to ride in a Jaguar, but there I am running behind this vehicle, which is not of my own making and of my own creation, yeah? So I think that it's quite useful to think about the kind of flanking measures that we need in order to then mitigate the adverse social impacts of any free trade agreement and any global value chain addition. Because unless we shift our language significantly, we're gonna keep getting the same results and that same lousy menu that we don't quite want. I'm done.
She started off by talking about this being a luxurious moment. I feel spoiled after that contribution. Absolutely and utterly spoiled. Thank you. Such intellectually stimulating contribution, and you've raised so many things that I really hope that we're going to begin to engage with as we sit here today. That let's not make the mistake of confusing feminist language and the space of gender economics. We're not talking about coming in post-framing to begin to say what's left on the table and how do we get a slice of it, but it's coming in at the forefront at a definitional space and saying, how do we give meaning to the terms that we're going to be discussing. We're talking about, Lebohang has raised the issue of global value chains being relational, and for us to think about the posture of, oftentimes, the posture of a rational man that we bring into these conversations, where the reality is one of great irrationality, because relationships are by very nature irrational, and how do we begin to think about things that get complicated, like rules of origin, that are not as clear-cut as it's sometimes captured in these documents. She's raised us to begin to think about value, and you remind me of a conversation I was moderating at the ILO in Geneva, and the conversation was about care work. And somebody put up their hand in the audience, and they said, I don't have a question, I have a comment. And this is a woman, and she stood up and she said, if we wanted men to get involved in care work, all we need to do is pay them for it. And the reason why men are absent in care work is because we have accepted that this is work that we don't deserve to be paid for. And that contribution has never, ever left me, because it is about exercising agency about what is value, who values it, and how do we then give value to those particular pieces of work. And finally, how do we begin to think beyond GDP? What does that look like? Because it can't just be just about GDP. So lots of luxurious spoiling for us in this particular panel as we start. I'm going to move on now, and I'm going to invite Korkor to share with us some of her thoughts. She's put together a brief presentation that she's going to talk us through, and then we're going to open it up and let's have a conversation. Over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. So I'm not an economist. How many economists are there in the room? Just put up your hand if you're an economist. 1, 2, 3. 5. How many feminists are here? Okay. Half a room. So I'm probably representing somewhere in between that, right? I'm a development practitioner. My passion is in entrepreneurship and transformational leadership and change. So I'm going to talk from that perspective, and I'm really glad that our sister Lebohang here has really given the economist's perspective of feminist economics. I work with the Graca Machel Trust, and I would say that the work I do is really about feminist work. How do we empower and get... So my role is the Women's Economic and Social Advancement Program Manager. And so the work I do is really around how do we increase representation for women in key sectors, finance, agriculture, energy, extractives, etc. And how do we also increase access to resources, finance, markets, and land, okay? So it's from that perspective that I'm going to do, and I'm also going to start with, because we're talking about the feminist economics, I'm also going to start with this idea that, let me just get my presentation, I'm sorry. And I had to write this because this was like taking myself back to school, right? I needed to do a bit of research to get this, right. So we basically work across the continent doing this. We work in 17 countries to really ensure that we're mobilizing and organizing. And I want to congratulate Rahima and Lebo for this partnership that you brought together to do this work. This teamwork. And for me, this demonstrates what we all need to be doing. I was in business for 15 years. And 15 years ago when I left, I said I would never go back to business and do it alone. So the message that we're getting here, and I think even from our first presenters that we're going to have throughout the day, is collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. How do we do that as women? Especially when we want to bring about transformation. So I was told by a wise man a long time ago that the secret to life is round. And I've taken many years to kind of unpack that. And so when I look at the map of the world, I look at the circular thing, and I think of it as a system. And then I look at some of the philosophies we've had about the yin and the yang, the masculine and feminine, and see what are we trying to do in everything that we're trying to do. And even in this feminism work that we do, it's about bringing about balance and equality and equity. So I want us to bear that in mind. And I was hoping there'll be more men in the room here, because what we want to appeal is what we are wanting is recalibrating for balance. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going ahead because I have... okay, so this is this is that. And then, right. Lebohang has unpacked it, so I'm not going to go through it, except I want to say that when I did my little research about economics and feminist economics, I realized that economics talks about man, machines, and money, right? And feminist economics talks about care. And also, what is clear is that because there's a marginalized group that's called women, and most of our work is in the informal sector, we've also got to recognize that what is defined mostly the economics defines work as formal work, right? And yet there's a whole sector of the society that is informal. So I have actually coined a definition for myself of feminist economics is. And it's based on the idea that feminism seeks and promotes equal opportunity and rights for women and minorities in the economic, political, social, legal, and personal freedoms. And this is really important. What I'm defining feminist economics as is redefining economics as inclusive and caring as it seeks to address basic needs. Now, how do we cover this base of basic needs for all of us? Because when we talk about the informal economy, it's about everybody trying to make ends meet. And government talks about unemployment, we're all looking to alleviate poverty and everything. So if we're not thinking about it being around basic needs, then I don't know what we're talking about. Really bringing about an inclusive way of being so that we talk about basic needs. So the imbalance for me was this idea about, and because we're talking about a formal sector and informal sector. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. We're talking about a formal and informal sector. Sorry, okay. I thought, let's talk to this. is actually a diagram from UN Women. And it talks about the fact that in sub-Saharan Africa, 89% of the population it's informal, and it's mostly women. And we talk about cross-border trade, like Nigeria, we talked about cross-border trade. 70% of agricultural labor is done by women on the continent. 70% of trade that goes to over $1 billion, I don't know what the statistics, the real one is done by women in cross-border trade. So these are not small things. Yesterday I also came, I was with Nadira in Addis. We were with the International Trade Center and She Trade, and we went to the AU to put a stake in the ground about this Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement and how women participate. And one of the things that came up there was the idea that we need to be very, very organized. The business associations were there, entrepreneurs were there, we were there to do that, but one of the things that came up over and over again is this idea of fragmentation. We are not united enough. How are we going to unite business associations, women entrepreneurs, to be able to take ourselves seriously in this Free Continental Trade Agreement? But when we talk about this neglect, right, we're talking about, because there's neglect, most of the work that women do has no social protection, there's no rights, very often no rights to work, and decent working conditions. When I was on the plane back as well, I was sat next to a 23-year-old, lovely young lady who was very excited about coming to South Africa to meet her husband, who she had not met because she's Muslim and she was married. She married him in absentia, which she said was very, very common. So I asked her, what are you going to do? And she says, I'm going to be a housewife. And I said, that's great. And then I thought, oh, I'm coming to do this talk, and the work that I do, I've got to ask her, is this enough? And she says, well, that is what, my mother does, and we all believe that men will provide for us. And I said, what happens when he dies? And so the conversation went on, and then we stopped, right? But the one thing I did come away from feeling is this idea of there's a yielding, which is lovely, but there was also a powerlessness that this left me with. So in our conversation about trying to redress this imbalance of informal work, right, it's said that in sub-Saharan Africa, it costs us something like 95 billion annually with this neglect that we leave the informal sector to just survive on its own. So I think the question about equity has come up, and so I've also looked up equity, and it simply just means giving everyone what they need to succeed. What do we need to give people in the informal sector, women who work in the informal sector? My mother is an awesome trader from West Africa. It was from her sweat and blood that we all went to school. And I know most of us that are sitting here, our education, our sustenance over the years was at the bedrock of our mother's work, which is said to be informal. Our brothers, where they are, when they go to the boardroom and they forget that there was a mother who sweated, there was a sister who did this, all comes from this idea that women work hard. When I was also leaving the airport, the airport in Addis, I saw possibly like this young lady, even though she's gone to this relationship thinking she's going to be a housewife, women carrying loads. And Addis airport is exciting because you have the domestic and the international, but you go through the same channel, and you see the things women are carrying. Ordinary-looking women carry this through this. You know they are the heart of economic drive in Addis, and in Africa for that matter. So we talk about equity. What do we need to give women to succeed? Now, equality is a human rights issue. We are all equal in the eyes of the law, right? And in ourselves, in our humanity, if we don't value ourselves as equals, then God help us. I think we're really in trouble. So I'm not going to, this is feminist language too, I'm not going to use clinical, whatever, sanitized language, because that is also not women. I don't think that's me, okay? So I'm going to say things as I feel they need to be said, because that's freedom for me. Yeah. So in terms of what we're trying to do is we believe that if we work with equity and equality, both equity and equality, it's important in realizing respect, fairness, and care for each other. So I'm just going to, say it like that. And then it also helps in harmonizing relationship. We can't have this great divide between man and woman. Like as if we're not born of the same mother, of the same father. When we come in the public space, like we don't know each other. When we're in our domestic home space, we have sons, we have uncles, we have brothers. So how do we harmonize this relationship? This inevitable, eternal relationship that we have with men. And then also, how do we unleash human potential? Because all of us are taken as mattering, that we matter. All of us. And then, of course, there's always the business case. I think the business case kind of, it's good and it's important, but if we don't value our intrinsic value as human beings, men and women, the business case will always just say that economic language that we're talking about. That is man, money, and what's the
Machines.
Machines. That's right. So that is what we bring to it. So I think for me, this really should allow us as women, wherever we are, to know that what we bring to the table matters. When we are in the boardroom, let's make sure that we are not quiet because we matter. However we say, you see how I'm saying it? It's not clean, it is how I need to say it because that is how my confidence right now allows me to say it. That is the confidence and the power we need to go to the boardroom and speak, and wherever we are, because we matter. Now, it is clear. How do we harness women's potential? Because generally, as I said before, women pay for the health, education, the well-being of their families and communities. That's a fact. Most men will never disagree with this. It's a fact. Research also shows that investing in women and increasing gender equality are the most effective means of promoting inclusive, sustainable growth. Right? So let's leverage that. Let's make sure, and maybe I'm talking to the converted in the room, but there's a whole generation of us here who are not here right now. So when we talk to them, how do we take everybody, how do we take as many women with us on this idea that we have and the belief that we have around these issues? We're also saying that increasing gender equality and women's empowerment can bolster Southern Sahara's economies by 300 billion by 2025. The invitation, I think we've talked about it, Lebohang, that we can't just look at GDP, because that's really looking at money, machines, and man, okay? We need to include the care factor that addresses the basic needs of all. I think we've talked about the unpaid work, the unpaid care work, which is intangible, but we all feel it and know it when we are being cared for.
Yeah.
Our biggest need in life right now, as I know it now, is care and love. We all need it. So let's name it as such. I also want this feminist language to be such that when we go to the public space, we say what it is, right? What do we need? We all need care. We need love. We need compassion. Let's normalize those languages in the space. Let's normalize that language. Because that is what really matters. Even men, at the heart of the matter, this is when they come home to their mamas and their lovers and whatever it is, what do? This is about love. Let's normalize that language. And so I think the challenge, and then, there's this idea of breadwinners versus, I'm calling it breadwinners versus bread makers. Let's value this partnership between breadwinners and bread makers. And I also want to talk about this idea, this challenge. We have a challenge of equality and equity. And I think it's phenomenal because it will stimulate creativity and innovation. We think it's impossible to do this gender task. It's not. Man, we have been able to put people on the moon. When I look around me, it was all from a vision and imagination that made all these things possible. So let's imagine that all that we seek is possible. We can deal with the issue of inequality. It's a choice we need to make. Issue of inequality and issue of equity. How do we make it possible for every single one of us to succeed in what they do and what they love to be associated with. And lastly, in the work that I do, we talk about the collective, always the collective. How do we unite? How do we organize ourselves? How do we unite ourselves and then seek and push the transformation that we want? Have you done? Thank you. Because if we don't get organized, and I've done this long enough to really believe it deeply in my being, that if we don't unite and we don't organize, we don't have any hope in hell of bringing about the transformation that we think we need. And I believe we can transform the world when we are united. So let's get all the marginalized group, because feminism also looks beyond just women. It's all the marginalized group, the disabled, the LBGD, all the different groups that are not considered and are not, currently do not sit at the table where decision-making is made. Let's all get together and make sure that we are represented on that decision-making table. And then I also believe that because we talk about representation, that how do we feminize and bring more, I think we talked about 5 economists in the room, right? So you guys have a lot of work to do, ladies. And because it means that where we're talking about the macro and microeconomics and that, how do we feminize that language? How do we bring about that gender-sensitive discussion around the representation of women and minorities in that discussion? And then lastly, we need a lot of access to resources. When we went to Addis this time, we talked to our business association. One of the things I put up my hand to say is that I work with business associations. Our biggest challenge is that nobody wants to fund business associations. They should be funded like a government department because they serve a very useful purpose. Finding administrators in business associations is one of the biggest challenges. And if you don't have a person that can answer the phone and even start talking to how do we organize and mobilize this thing and make it happen, it represents women's interests, nothing happens. So we have a lot of business associations that are not performing because nobody funds them. And they're the ones who want to seek for access to resources, markets, finance, skills, etc. Training, because God knows we need the training. But nobody is sitting or wanting to fund business associations. So one of the things, the last thing I want to really say is that we need to appeal and we need to demand from the powers that be that we need capital in the hands of women. We need resources, because without that, we're going to be, humming this for a very long time, but we're not going to move fast. But it also needs to be known that women, when you put money in the hands of women, we transform communities and societies.
Thank you very much. Sure. And such potent insights you've shared with us. And I was standing there engaging with my reaction to the point that you made about why don't we call things what they are? Care and love. Why do we not normalize, and why do we go for the clinical language that isn't modeled on the posture of who we are in the first place? So thank you so much for triggering a lot of those thoughts for us and landing on the point that at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we put capital in women's hands. And not women in relationships where they're begging for capital because he has to provide, right? So how do we put capital in women's hands? And in the process of putting capital in their hands, we are putting agency and power in their hands to make the necessary decisions. Thank you for talking to us about, and I know this sounds a little bit off-center, but I actually think it's such an important point that you've made. There's a difference between yielding and being powerless. And it's important that even as we think about the negotiations and the relational aspects that show up in global value chains, that relationships are a balance of yielding and taking and giving. They're not about powerlessness, but there is a place for conversation on yielding and powerlessness in economics of women on the continent. And thank you for raising that point.